second story now. Now this one is for older children, and it is a Scottish story. It comes from the Orkney Islands, which are to the north of Scotland, off the mainland. And the proper title for this, and if anybody is Scottish who is listening, and I think Mara might be listening, I'm probably going to pronounce it all wrongly, but the title of this story is Assispattle and Meester Stoorworm. Assispattle is a very old word. Now, the Orkney word for ashes is asses, A-S-S-I-S, not asses like donkeys, asses. So it's ashy, and pattle is a paddle, something flat like that. So it's about a little boy who is a bit like Cinderella and spends all his time mucking around in the fire ashes. So instead of being called Cinders or Cinder Fella, they call him Ashy, or Ashy, well, let's say Ashy Paws, Ashy Hands. But in this story, I'm just going to call him Ash for short. And a stoorworm actually is a huge, really foul sea dragon. And so sometimes I might call it a stoorworm, sometimes I might call it a sea dragon. So this is one of my favourite stories of all time. Once, a long, long time ago, there was a king, and he had a beautiful daughter and a fine land. And he had a land that was farmed. Most of his subjects were farmers. And there was a farmer who had 7 sons. And the youngest, he had a perfectly good name. It was probably Hamish or Dougal or something. But he was called Ash because he spent all his time playing in the ashes by the fire. And his father and his brothers used to say, "Come on, Ash, come and do some work." But his mum would say, "Oh, he's only little, leave him alone." And he loved making castles out of the charred logs in the fireplace and watching the light sparkle. And if any little sparks rose up from the fire, he would say it was fairy soldiers going out to war. And he used to make up great stories about the castle of the fire. And his father said, no, he's got to learn to work. People didn't go to school in those days. So eventually, with a lot of pulling and tugging and persuading and being cross, Ash was dragged out to learn to work on the farm. But every 2 minutes, he would sit by the fire, staring into the ashes. Oh, he loved it there. Now, one day, something strange happened. In the sea, just at the end of their farm, there were big, black, heavy waves, and a new island seemed to have risen up in the sea. But it wasn't an island because it was swimming around and thrashing around, and it opened its mouth and it smashed its tail down, and it began to roar. And messages were sent to the king. "The stoorworm is back. The sea dragon has returned." And the king was horrified because he knew how evil this stoorworm, this sea dragon, could be. It could eat an whole island if it put its mind to it. It would chew up ships, it would crunch up sailors, it would cause endless devastation. It didn't come very often, but when it stayed, it would eat and eat and eat and destroy things and then only go when there was nothing else to eat. The king was horrified. And he sent for his wise counsellors and for his chief magician and said, "What do I do?" Well, they thought of all sorts of things like shooting cannonballs at the stoorworm or sending fighting ships out to try and kill it. But all that had been tried before, and everybody knew it didn't work because the dragon's scales were so hard. And then the magician said, "I've got an idea, sire, but you won't like it." "Well, anything," said the king. So the magician said, "Dragons like this have a taste for young people. If you tie up 7 children and put them on the quayside, then I think the dragon will come and eat them and then go away satisfied." The king was horrified, but various people said, well, there's quite a few annoying children. I'm sure we can get some really bad children that everybody hates. Well, the king didn't want to do that to his subjects, especially children, but what could he do? He had to save the country. He had to save everybody. So for a week or two, the worst children in the island were rounded up, and then every Saturday morning 7 were tied up and put on the quay, and the stoorworm would swim out of the sea, and the waves would rise up and lash against the rocks, and the great hideous head would come up, open its mouth and wide its eyes, and go and eat the children. Well, after 2 or 3 weeks of this, people began to complain because even the bad children were loved. And the king thought, we've got to do something else. And he couldn't think what. And then the magician said, there is one thing you could try, sire. And that is, if you sacrifice your only child, your daughter, the Princess Gem the Lovely, I think the dragon might go away then. The king was horrified. What do you mean, might go away? And the magician said, well, there's only so much we can do. We can't guarantee anything. Oh, the king thought. And he knew that he couldn't keep asking people to sacrifice their own children and not be willing to sacrifice his own. So he said, send a proclamation throughout all the world that any knight who comes and rescues us from this terrible stoorworm, I will give him the whole of the kingdom when I die, and he may marry my daughter when she's old enough. So the message went out, and knights came from left and right. And some looked at the stoorworm and ran away. Others looked at the stoorworm and said they were thinking, and they drank all the king's food and drank all his wine and hid in the cellar. Nobody had a plan or knew what to do. There was only a day or 2 left before the Lady Gem the Lovely had to be sacrificed to the dragon. Meanwhile, you thought I'd forgotten about Ash, but I hadn't. Meanwhile, Ash was sitting, stirring up the ashes by the fire at home. And his dad and his brothers dragged him outside and said, come on, you've got to clean the barn, you've got to milk the cows, you've got to sweep the yard, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And Ash said, but I'm busy. Well, what are you busy doing? I'm busy trying to think of a way to rescue the princess. And his brothers laughed at him and thumped him. And they dragged him off into the barn and hid him under a haystack. He's useless, they said. And when Ash didn't come in for supper, his dad went out, and seeing the haystack wobbling and somebody going from inside, his father pulled all the hay aside and said, what are you doing? And he saw Ash was covered with bruises and said, what have you been up to? And Ash said, it's not me, it's my brothers. They thumped me because I want to rescue the princess. And his father laughed and said, well, you should thump them back. And Ash pulled himself high and said, thumping people back doesn't solve anything. Thinking about problems and thinking of a solution does help. And his father laughed because he didn't believe in thinking or in stories or daydreaming. And Ash said, thinking and daydreaming will save the country. I know it will. And his father clouted him and said, come on, wash. It's supper time. Well, that night, when everything was quiet, Ash lay finishing his plan. He was almost there. He was almost certain how to do things. And at the same time, and this is the night before Saturday, it's Friday night, and the king is sitting stroking his beard and worrying. And then he looks up above his fire, where there is a big, long sword. In his younger days, the king used to be a very good fighter, and that had been his sword, and it had a name called Snickersnapper. And he used to fight very well with that sword, but it was blunt and rusty. But he thought, I can't ask my subjects to die if I'm not willing to fight. So he reached up and took the sword down. Oh, it was heavy. Oh, he was out of condition. And he started to polish it and sharpen it. And then he sent a servant down to the beach to get his own private boat out of the boathouse, and to get the boatman to wake up and go and sit in the boat and be ready, for he at dawn would take the boat and go out and fight the dragon. And he started to sharpen and polish and polish and sharpen. Meanwhile, Ash was lying in his bed, tossing and turning. At last, when he knew his brothers were asleep because they stopped rowing, and his mum and dad were both snoring, he got up, he put on his clothes, and he went downstairs, and he took his mum's bread knife. He took some peat from the fire. Now, for those of you that don't know, peat is what people in some places use instead of coal or wood for a fire. It's sort of a very ancient bog roots and plants which have sort of become sort of halfway to coal, really, and it burns very slowly. And he took a big chunk of peat out of the fire, and it was really hot, so he used thick gloves and put it in his mum's best cooking pot. So he's got the cooking pot, the peat, mum's bread knife, and he took a whistle out of his dad's pocket, and he crept out of the door, across the farmyard and into the stables. And in the stables was his dad's favourite horse. It was a big black stallion, and it had got a really funny name. It was called Teetgong. And Teetgong was a bit magic. Now, the only reason Ash knew it was magic was because he listened. He'd heard his mum and dad discussing the horse. And so he knew exactly what to do. He put the saddle onto Teetgong and the bridle, and the horse began to stamp and neigh very loudly. And he knew that the magic to make the horse stand quiet was to pat it on its left shoulder. And the horse stood quiet and still. And Ash tied the pot and the peat, and he put the knife in it as well. He tied them all onto the back of the saddle. And then he got in. And then the next bit of magic was he tapped the horse on its right shoulder. And the horse trotted out of the stable. But of course his father had heard the horse go, neigh, and had woken up. And he'd opened his bedroom window to see what was going on. And in the dark, he couldn't make out it was Ash. He thought someone was stealing his precious horse. "Oi," he said, "come back." But the third bit of magic Ash knew was if he blew on his dad's whistle, wasn't it? It was a funny sort of dry whistle made out of a goose's windpipe. Made a funny noise. Then that was the magic spell to make that horse go faster and jump higher than any other horse. And hearing the noise, Teetgong ran up to the farm gate, leapt over it and was gone. And Ash's father sat miserably back on his bed, for he had lost his favourite horse and there was nothing in the world that could catch him. Meanwhile, Ash was galloping towards the king's palace and the harbour where the princess was going to be tied up and left for the dragon in the morning. Well, the king polished his sword and polished his armour and was getting himself strapped in. Princess Gemda Lovely was sitting in her room, crying and saying farewell to her best friends, and she put on her best dress because she was going to die with dignity. And Ash rode and rode and rode. The sky in the east was getting a little bit lighter. Dawn was coming. Ash knew he had to hurry, so he blew again on this funny whistle, and the horse put on a spurt, and he rode and rode all the way down to the harbour. And there, in the very, very faint light, he saw a boat ready in the harbour, and there was a man sitting in it. And he said to the man, "It's a cold day, isn't it?" And the man said, "Have you come to watch the princess die?" And Ash said, "Oh, yes, I wouldn't miss it, not for the world, our lovely princess. I'm going to light a fire, I'm cold. Do you want to come and join me?" And the man in the boat said, "Oh, no, 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 I can't. I've got to guard the king's boat because it's got to be ready because he's going to try and rescue the princess." Oh, thought Ash, how is he going to get the man out of the boat? He needed a boat. So he lit a fire, and because he used a bit of the peat out of the pot and some driftwood, and it was beginning to burn. And then he found a penny in his pocket, and he'd been given the penny for his birthday and he hadn't spent it. And he had an idea. And while he was digging a hole in the sand to build up around the fire so the wind didn't blow it out, he said, "Oh, look, I found money." And the man sitting in his boat said, "Money? What sort of money?" And Ash held it up and said, "Look, I think it's gold. Oh, there's a lot here. Do you want some?" And the man said, "Not half," and he jumped out of the boat. And Ash put his penny on the ground so the man could see it. And he said, "Look, just dig here. There's lots and lots." And then as the man started to dig, Ash leapt away, ran down the beach, onto the boat, got out the oars, and he rowed for his life. And the man said, "Oi, come back!" But the water was deep there, and he couldn't swim, so he couldn't run out to get Ash and bring him back. Ash rowed and rowed and rowed, and in the soft grey light he could see the huge mountain that was the Stoorworm. Do you remember how you said it looked like an island out at sea? And he rowed and he rowed and he rowed and he rowed, for he knew as soon as the dragon woke he would be hungry. Well, the sun slowly began to warm the sky. Ash rowed as fast as he could. Now, one thing he wasn't quite sure about, although he dreamt up the whole story, was how he was going to get the dragon to open his mouth wide enough to get inside without being munched up and chewed by the dragon's teeth. But he needn't have worried, because as the sun rose, it caught in the dragon's eyes, and he realised it was morning, and it was time for breakfast, time to crunch up a young person or seven. And as you and I often do, the dragon opened his mouth and went, "Oh." And as he did, he swallowed lots of seawater. And with that seawater, he swallowed the boat. And with the boat, he swallowed Ash. Now, have you ever been to the swimming pool where they've got flumes, big whirly tubes that go all the way down? Well, that's what Ash felt like. He felt he was like on a flume going whee all the way down the dragon's throat into his tummy. Now, inside the dragon's stomach, it was hot. It was smelly. Now, do you know what phosphorescence is? Phosphorescence is tiny little algae which sort of glow in the dark. And the dragon had swallowed lots of phosphorescence. The water had this sort of sickly green glow, and as it moved and glooped around chewed up, not quite digested ships or half-eaten whales. Yes, he was big enough to eat a whole whale. And lots of bits and pieces and debris he'd eaten and not digested. Oh, and it stank. But in the soft green eerie light, Ash got out of the boat and climbed over bits of wreckage. Wasn't much room in there. And he got out his mum's bread knife and he cut through the stomach lining of the Stoorworm, the dragon. And he got the pot with the peat. Now, you know what happens if you put oil and fire together? Whoosh! Well, this dragon had got lots of oily fat around its stomach. So when he cut open the stomach lining and he pushed the lump of burning peat inside, it went sizzle, 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 whoosh! And it started to burn. Oh, Ash was coughing and gasping, and the fire was beginning to leap up and getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and Ash was getting really frightened and really worried because he'd forgotten to daydream how to get out. But he made his way as carefully as he could in that greenish, weird light through the smoke until he came to the bottom of the dragon's throat. And he thought, I'm just going to have to push my way out. But the smoke began to make the dragon feel sick, and the fire gave him tummy ache, and he started to retch and to heave until he was sick. And out with the sick came Ash, and it spewed up in the air. Bits of ship and bits of whale and bits of half-digested sailor and, octopuses and smaller dragons and all sorts of things he'd eaten. It all went puking and spewing up in the sky, as well as Ash. And Ash went, whee! Well, at least I'm going to land in the water. Splash! And he swam, because there were big waves everywhere, for the dragon was in so much pain. Now he was on fire inside. He started to thrash and yell and screech and scream, and big waves were slamming against the rocks, and Ash swam for all he was worth. And then suddenly the great sea dragon went "Bah!" and bits of dragon went splash, 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 splash. Some people say that his head landed somewhere between Denmark and Norway, making the two great seaways, the Skattegat and Kattegat. Other people say that his teeth landed north of Scotland and became the islands of Orkney and Shetland, and that lumps of his flesh landed on the Scottish islands and into Norway and made the mountains. I don't know if that's true, but it's a good story. Anyway, Ash pulled himself out of the water, straight into the delighted arms of the king. "You saved us," said the king. And he had Ash taken back to the castle, and everybody cheered, for the Stoorworm was really dead. And Gemda Lovely was so thrilled, she came and gave him some of her best books. Ash was given a royal bath. His parents were sent for, and his brothers, and in front of everybody the king knighted Ash and said, "Name your reward." And Ash said, "I would like it to be the law that in schools and everywhere all across the land, everybody has to have at least one story a day, because stories help you think, and daydreaming teaches you how to solve problems." And the king was so delighted he made that law from that day onwards, and they still do it in his country. Now, as to whether Ash married Gemda Lovely or not, I don't know. They were both a bit young, but they did love reading books together.